The California sun had no mercy that morning. Its heat pressed down over the naval training base like a living thing, thick, blinding, and relentless. Even the ocean breeze carried more grit than relief, rolling through the open hangars with the smell of salt, diesel, and steel polish. Inside the base, the rhythmic bark of drill sergeants and the echo of boots on asphalt created a melody that every recruit eventually learned by heart. Discipline in motion. Private First Class Evan Marshall was already drenched in sweat before 0900 hours. It was inspection day, the worst kind. Everything had to gleam. The landing pads, the vehicles, the weapons racks, even the insignias on the soldiers' chests. His unit had been assigned to clean the supply deck, a stretch of concrete so wide it could bake an egg in minutes. He was young, 22, fresh from a small town in Ohio, where his biggest battle had been waking up early for football practice. Here, life was different, faster, sharper, unforgiving. Mistakes didn't just earn scolding. They earned marks that followed you for months. "Marshal," barked Sergeant Daniels, his voice cutting through the sound of humming engines. "Get that hose over there. I want every inch of that landing pad spotless before the brass shows up." "Yes, Sergeant," Evan shouted, bolting toward the equipment rack. He was nervous. Everyone was. The rumor was that a new commander was visiting the base today, someone high-ranking, maybe even from D.C. It meant one thing. If even a single speck of dirt was out of place, heads would roll. And Evan didn't want his name anywhere near that fallout. He grabbed the industrial hose and dragged it toward the edge of the pad, where a small puddle of oil shimmered in the sunlight. A shadow moved nearby, someone standing still, half in the sun, half in the shade, watching the activity. The figure wore a crisp, spotless uniform, but the rank pins were partially obscured by the sunlight glinting off her collar. Evan didn't look twice. He just assumed she was another rookie recruit, waiting for instructions, maybe even lost. Without a second thought, he twisted the nozzle and aimed. A powerful stream of water blasted out, arching beautifully through the air, before crashing down all over the figure's front. The person didn't move, didn't even flinch. Water dripped from her immaculate cap, sliding down the sleeves of her freshly pressed uniform. Slowly, she turned. Evan's grin froze on his face. Every muscle in his body went rigid as his gaze locked onto her rank insignia, 2 silver stars gleaming under the dripping sunlight. Rear Admiral Rebecca Cole. The world seemed to stop spinning. For a long, unbearable second, all he could hear was the hiss of water hitting the ground. His hands trembled, and the hose slipped from his grip, writhing on the concrete like a startled snake. Around him, nearby soldiers froze mid-motion. Conversations died. Even the sergeant who had been shouting moments ago went silent. Rebecca Cole's eyes met his. They were a piercing gray, cold, calm, and utterly unreadable. Her face was expressionless, neither angry nor amused. She simply reached up, removed her soaked cap, and shook off a few drops of water as if brushing away dust. Evan's throat went dry. He snapped into a salute so fast he nearly smacked himself in the forehead. "Ma'am, I didn't." She said nothing. Not one word. Instead, she placed her cap back on her head, gave a curt nod, and walked past him without even glancing at the hose still spewing water. The sound of her boots against the wet pavement echoed louder than any shout could have. When she disappeared around the corner, the silence collapsed into whispers. "Oh my God," muttered one soldier nearby. "You just sprayed the Admiral," said another, eyes wide as dinner plates. "She's new here," someone whispered. "Just arrived this morning." "You really did it now, Marshal." Evan wanted the ground to swallow him whole. His face burned hotter than the asphalt beneath his boots. Sergeant Daniels finally spoke, his voice low and dangerous. "Private Marshall, you idiot." He ran a hand down his face, trying to contain his rage. "Do you have any idea what you've just done?" "I didn't know, Sergeant." "I swear, she was just standing there. You didn't know?" Daniels snapped. "You don't spray anyone who's not in your unit without checking. Do you have a death wish?" Evan's stomach churned. His mind raced through every possible punishment. Demotion, extra duty, formal reprimand, maybe even discharge. He imagined his record forever, stamped with the words, disrespect toward superior officer. His military career, barely started, might already be over. The rest of the day moved like a slow-motion nightmare. Everywhere he went, eyes followed him. In the mess hall, conversation stopped when he walked in. On the training field, soldiers smirked or whispered. He could feel their stares like needles in his back. Even Daniels, normally a fair man, gave him double chores that evening to help him think about his choices. But what haunted Evan most wasn't the embarrassment. It was the Admiral's silence. She hadn't yelled, hadn't scolded, hadn't even looked angry. That calm expression was worse than any outburst could have been. It felt like she had looked through him, as if she'd seen everything he was, everything he wasn't, and simply decided it wasn't worth reacting to. That night, lying on his bunk, Evan couldn't sleep. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw her face soaked, expressionless, and composed. He thought of how much self-control it took for someone of her rank to stand there and not explode. What kind of person was she? By midnight, he made himself a promise. Whatever she saw in him that day, he would change it. The next morning came early. The sun wasn't even up when Evan was already out by the yard, scrubbing the same landing pad he had disgraced the day before. The world was quiet, save for the distant crash of waves and the rhythmic hum of far-off drills. His arms ached, but he didn't stop. Every swipe of the brush felt like penance. At some point, footsteps echoed behind him. He turned and froze again. It was her. Admiral Cole stood at the edge of the pad, hands clasped behind her back, eyes fixed on him. She said nothing, just watched. Evan's heart raced, but he didn't dare speak. After a moment that felt like an eternity, she finally spoke, her voice smooth, calm, almost too even. "Discipline begins where comfort ends, Private." Then she turned and walked away, leaving him staring after her, unsure whether that was forgiveness, warning, or a lesson. One thing was clear. She remembered him. And so began a strange, silent connection between a clumsy young soldier and a new admiral who didn't believe in shouting. For Evan, it was just the beginning of a journey that would test not just his strength, but his pride, patience, and the very meaning of respect. The sun rose over the naval base like a silent judge, casting long shadows across the rows of dormitories, vehicles, and gleaming hangars. The morning heat was already oppressive, but for Private Evan Marshall, it didn't matter. Every breath he drew felt heavy, weighted by the memory of yesterday, the hose, the splash, the Admiral's calm gray eyes. That single moment had changed his life in ways he couldn't yet understand. He walked through the barracks like a ghost. The wooden floorboards creaked under his boots, a chorus of whispers following him. Every soldier he passed seemed to pause, glance, and then smirk or whisper. There he is, the guy who drenched the Admiral. Even the recruits, fresh from their first week, seemed to know. Rumors had already spread faster than wildfire. Evan clenched his fists to keep them from shaking. He tried to avoid eye contact, but it was impossible. The weight of stairs pressed into him like a physical force. Every hallway, every corner, every breakfast table seemed to carry judgment. And yet, amidst the whispers, there was an undercurrent of curiosity. Why hadn't she punished him? Why hadn't she yelled? Why hadn't she fired him on the spot? The answer, her silence, was worse. At breakfast, Sergeant Daniels sat across from him, leaning forward, eyes narrowing. "Private," he said, voice low, almost a growl. "You understand what you did yesterday?" "Yes, Sergeant," Evan replied, keeping his voice steady even as his stomach churned. "No, you don't," Daniels said. He slammed his hand against the table for emphasis, rattling the coffee mugs. "Do you have any idea what happens when you make a mistake with someone like that? You just humiliated the base, humiliated the military, and humiliated yourself." Evan nodded, words caught in his throat. He had no defense. "Yes, Sergeant," he whispered. Daniels leaned back, exhaling. "Good. Now get out there and start cleaning again. And this time, check twice who's standing near you before you spray anything." Outside, the base was alive with activity. Soldiers moved in formation. Drills echoed, vehicles roared, and the scent of diesel and polished steel filled the air. Evan's hose was back in his hands, but he gripped it with a mixture of fear and determination. Every droplet of water he sprayed now felt like penance. Every sweep of the brush was a silent promise. He would not repeat this mistake. But there was no escape from her presence. Rear Admiral Rebecca Cole had begun her rounds that morning. She didn't yell, she didn't scold, and she didn't appear visibly angry. Instead, she walked among the soldiers with a calm, almost surgical precision, observing, noting, cataloging. Her gray eyes swept the yard like a hawk's, settling briefly on Evan whenever he passed, holding his gaze for a heartbeat longer than normal. That quiet watchfulness gnawed at him more than any reprimand could. Was she planning something? Testing him? Judging him? Or was she just silently disappointed? Evan didn't know, and that uncertainty was worse than fear. He threw himself into work, scrubbing the hangar floor, polishing vehicles, arranging equipment, every action executed with precision, even though his hands trembled from nerves. Sweat ran down his temples, dripping onto the concrete, but he didn't stop. He couldn't stop. Not while the Admiral was watching. The hours crawled. By mid-morning, the whispers had spread beyond the barracks. Soldiers from other units glanced toward his section with a mix of amusement and disbelief. Some even started keeping small bets. How long before he finally screwed up again? How long before the Admiral lost patience? Evan's only solace was in the rhythm of labor. There was a strange clarity in the repetitive motions. The brush scraping, the water hissing, the clink of metal. In the midst of humiliation, a seed of resolve began to grow. If he survived today, he could survive anything. During the noon inspection, Evan lined up with his unit. Every uniform crease, every polished button, every neatly tucked insignia was checked with meticulous care. When the Admiral passed in her silent, controlled stride, Evan felt her gaze settle on him again. He couldn't tell whether it was curiosity, scrutiny, or subtle acknowledgement. She didn't speak. She didn't gesture. She simply moved forward, leaving him standing rigid, heart hammering, beads of sweat running down his neck. Later, at lunch, the atmosphere remained tense. The mess hall felt smaller somehow, filled with eyes that followed his every movement. Even as he ate mechanically, the whispers continued. He overheard snatches of conversation. Dude, he actually soaked the Admiral. Yeah, and she didn't even yell. That's scary. I wouldn't be able to sleep if I were him. Evan kept his head down, trying to ignore the words. He focused on his meal, on the sound of the spoon clinking against the tray, on the steady hum of the air conditioning. Anything to drown out the embarrassment. By mid-afternoon, the sun blazed even higher, and Evan returned to cleaning the exterior landing pads. This time, he worked slowly, deliberately, double-checking everything. aware that the Admiral's eyes were likely still on him somewhere. He caught glimpses of her shadow along the perimeter. She walked alone, clipboard in hand, reviewing logs, inspecting equipment, but occasionally she would pause, glance toward him, and continue. Each glance felt like a quiet assessment, a challenge, a silent question. "Are you worth watching, Private?" The rest of the afternoon passed in a tense blur. Evan's hands were raw, his muscles screamed, and every time water sprayed near him, he flinched. By the time the sun began to dip toward the horizon, painting the sky in orange and red hues, Evan had learned something important. Humiliation can be endured, but uncertainty can cut deeper than any reprimand. Finally, as evening approached and the base settled into a quieter rhythm, Sergeant Daniels approached him again. This time, the sergeant's expression was unreadable. "Marshal," he said, voice quieter than before, "you're still alive. That's impressive. But this isn't about surviving the day. It's about learning. And I think she's trying to teach you something." Evan swallowed, confused. "Teach me, Sergeant?" Daniels nodded slightly. "Not by yelling. Not by punishing. By watching. Pay attention, Private. The Admiral has a way of showing you who you are, if you're willing to see it." Evan stared at him, uncertain whether he had understood. But he knew one thing. He wouldn't be able to ignore her presence, her gaze, or the memory of that first drenched encounter. That night, as he lay in his bunk, he replayed the day's events over and over. The whispers, the glances, the quiet, controlled assessment of the Admiral, it all swirled in his mind. He realized that his mistake wasn't just a moment of clumsiness. It was a test, though he didn't yet know it. A test not of skill, but of character. Evan closed his eyes, sweat-soaked uniform still clinging to his back. A single thought burned through his exhaustion. "I will not be humiliated twice. I will earn her respect, whatever it takes." The seed of determination had been planted. And for Evan Marshall, the quiet war had only just begun. The following days blurred into a rhythm that Evan Marshall had never experienced before. Every sunrise brought new drills, inspections, and the suffocating certainty that somewhere nearby, Rear Admiral Rebecca Cole was silently observing him. It wasn't just her presence, it was her gaze, the unyielding gray eyes that seemed to see past his uniform, past his mistakes, straight into the man he was still trying to become. Evan had spent long hours scrubbing decks, polishing vehicles, and arranging equipment. But no matter how perfect his work seemed to him, he could feel her attention like a heat lamp trained on him. It wasn't always overt. Sometimes she was across the yard, arms clasped behind her back, clipboard in hand, occasionally nodding or jotting something down. Other times she appeared unexpectedly, walking past him silently, inspecting the smallest details of the hangar. He never knew when she would appear, and that unpredictability gnawed at him. His peers noticed the tension. Some whispered behind his back, offering dubious sympathy or barely concealed amusement. "You're going to snap one day, Marshal," one soldier said with a smirk as they passed during drill. "She's watching, isn't she?" Evan didn't reply. He didn't need to. He could feel her eyes on him, even in the mess hall. The ordinary clatter of trays and voices became a background score to his anxiety. Every misstep, every fumbled order felt magnified, and the memory of the hose, of the cold gray stare, never left him. By midweek, Evan began noticing subtle patterns. The Admiral rarely spoke directly to him, but she moved through the base with precision. She lingered near him when drills involved coordination or teamwork, sometimes observing quietly as he guided younger recruits through exercises. On other occasions, she appeared during routine maintenance or inspections, never speaking, but offering a nod that was almost imperceptible, a silent acknowledgement that he had done well or perhaps warning that he had not. Evan's anxiety shifted into determination. Every motion, every action, every command he executed became deliberate, almost painstaking. He moved slower at first, checking every detail twice, anticipating her scrutiny. His muscles ached from overcompensation, but he didn't stop. In his mind, he repeated over and over, "If she's watching, I will be worth watching." Yet even as he focused on perfection, self-doubt remained. He questioned everything he did. Did he polish that vehicle correctly? Was the landing pad aligned perfectly? Were his words crisp and authoritative when directing recruits? Evan realized, painfully, that this was no longer about avoiding punishment. This was about survival in the form of respect. And he had no idea what the Admiral considered respectful. One afternoon, the tension reached a new height. A surprise drill forced recruits and officers alike into a high-stress scenario, a simulated security breach at the base perimeter. Alarms blared, and the clang of doors and boots reverberated across the compound. Evan's unit was responsible for securing a critical hangar and guiding inexperienced recruits through emergency procedures. Sweat stung his eyes as he barked orders, his voice rising above the chaos. He could hear shouts and scrambling all around, the shrill ring of sirens echoing in his ears. And then, just beyond the chaos, he caught a glimpse of her. Admiral Cole had appeared quietly, standing on the edge of the drill area, arms crossed, expression neutral. Her eyes scanned every movement he made. Every decision, every instruction, every gesture was being evaluated. Evan's heart raced. One wrong step, one misdirected command, could undo all the effort he had made over the past week. But then he noticed something. She wasn't correcting him. She wasn't stepping in. She was letting him lead, quietly observing how he handled pressure, how he reacted when others panicked. And then it hit him. This was a test. Not a test of obedience or discipline, but of character, of composure, of resilience. For the first time since the hose incident, Evan felt a spark of confidence. He took a deep breath, straightened his shoulders, and issued orders with clarity. Secure the south wing. Lead recruits through the east corridor. Maintain communication. His voice, though strained, carried authority. Slowly, the recruits responded, moving in formation, following his guidance. The chaos remained, but order began to emerge within his sphere of command. By the end of the drill, the simulated breach was contained. Evan was exhausted, muscles trembling, sweat soaking through his uniform, but a sense of accomplishment coursed through him. He had survived the scrutiny, navigated the chaos, and kept his unit functioning. The Admiral approached quietly, walking beside him as the recruits filed back to their stations. She said nothing at first, her gaze calm and steady. Then, in a tone quiet but deliberate, she spoke. "You performed better than I expected, Private. You didn't falter under pressure. That is a start." Evan's chest tightened. He wasn't sure if it was relief, pride, or the sheer shock of hearing acknowledgement from someone he had feared for days. "Thank you, ma'am," he managed, voice strained but steady. Rebecca Cole nodded once and turned away, disappearing among the other officers. It wasn't praise, exactly. It wasn't even a commendation. But it was something more potent, a sign that she had seen him, that she had assessed him, and that she was interested in watching his growth. From that day on, Evan approached his duties differently. Fear was no longer the only motivator. There was now a thread of determination, woven with the subtle acknowledgement that he was not entirely invisible. Each day became an opportunity to learn, to improve, to anticipate challenges before they arose. Yet even as he improved, the whispers continued. Some soldiers admired him, others envied him, and a few openly mocked the situation. "Still under the Admiral's eye, huh?" one recruit whispered as they passed during a cleaning detail. Evan simply nodded, no longer ashamed. The scrutiny that had once crippled him was now a fuel, a lens through which he measured his own resilience. By the end of the week, Evan had begun to see a pattern in her behavior. She appeared when challenges were greatest, observing quietly from a distance. She intervened only when absolutely necessary, but often not even then, letting him navigate difficulty and emerge on his own. Her silence was not punishment, it was strategy. He began to understand that leadership was not about perfection or obedience alone. It was about composure under pressure, about learning from mistakes, about carrying responsibility, even when every nerve screamed to run. And slowly, he started to embrace the lessons, even without words. That evening, as the sun dipped behind the base's horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and crimson, Evan sat on the edge of the landing pad, exhausted but thoughtful. The hose incident that had once defined him no longer loomed as a symbol of failure. Instead, it was a starting point, a moment from which growth had begun. And somewhere on the base, watching silently, Rear Admiral Rebecca Cole allowed herself the smallest hint of satisfaction. The boy had potential, even if he didn't yet realize it. For Evan Marshall, the days ahead promised more challenges, more scrutiny, and more tests of character. But the seed of resilience had been planted, nurtured under the watchful eye of the Admiral. And for the first time, he felt something he hadn't felt in a long time, the possibility of redemption. The naval training base seemed almost serene in the early hours, a deceptive calm before the storm of drills, inspections, and operational routines that defined life for its soldiers. Yet, behind that tranquility, a quiet test was unfolding, a test known only to Rear Admiral Rebecca Cole. She observed the daily motions of her base, tracking not just tasks completed, but reactions under pressure, the subtle shifts in body language, and the decisions made when no one was watching. For Evan Marshall, the past few days had been a crucible. The initial embarrassment of the hose incident had transformed into a tense vigilance, with every move calculated, every command deliberate. He scrubbed, polished, and drilled, but even at his peak, he felt the invisible weight of her gaze. It followed him into the mess hall, across the parade ground, and even into the barracks. Each glance of those gray eyes was a silent question. Do you have what it takes? What Evan didn't yet know was that Admiral Cole's scrutiny was far from random. She had spent years studying human behavior under stress, watching as young soldiers faltered or rose to challenges. She remembered vividly the humiliation of her early days as a junior officer. She had been young, inexperienced, and underestimated. A superior officer had once publicly scolded her for a minor mistake, humiliating her in front of her unit. It had been crushing, a blow to both confidence and reputation. But instead of breaking her, it had forged her resilience, sharpened her focus, and ignited an unrelenting drive to become a leader who understood the power of observation and patience. Now, standing at the pinnacle of command, she applied the lessons of her past. Mistakes, she believed, could teach more than punishment ever could. And Evan Marshall, drenched and shivering from the hose incident days earlier, had unknowingly stepped into the center of her silent experiment. That morning, the Admiral walked the base perimeter alone. Her boots clicked against the concrete, measured and deliberate, eyes scanning for details invisible to most. The younger soldiers moved quickly, carrying out drills with precision, unaware of the lessons being quietly administered. Evan, polishing a row of rifles near the armory, felt the weight of her presence even before he saw her. "You're moving too fast," she said finally, her voice calm, almost gentle. Evan jumped slightly, his heart hammering. He had been so focused on completing the task quickly that he hadn't considered the finer points: alignment, polish, or safety protocol. "Yes, ma'am," he stammered. "Faster is meaningless if the work is sloppy," she continued, circling him like a predator studying prey. Precision under pressure. That is the mark of a soldier worth following. Do you understand? Evan nodded quickly, forcing himself to slow his movements, double-checking each weapon before placing it back. For a moment, he felt a strange combination of fear and inspiration. She wasn't yelling. She wasn't punishing. She was teaching. Later that day, she orchestrated a series of small challenges for him. First, a coordination exercise with newer recruits, requiring patience, clarity, and control. Evan struggled at first, his nerves fraying as he repeated instructions, corrected mistakes, and tried to maintain authority. Yet, at every misstep, she refrained from interference. Her silence was both pressure and guidance, a paradox he couldn't yet comprehend. During a break, she approached him again. "You remind me of myself," she said quietly, not as a critique, but as an observation. Evan froze. "Excuse me, ma'am? Years ago, I was exactly where you are now, eager, clumsy, uncertain, humiliated by a mistake, unsure if I could ever earn respect. I learned that the best way to grow is under observation, not under punishment. Mistakes are lessons, not liabilities. Every error you make now is shaping the soldier you will become. Do you understand?" "Yes, ma'am," he said, swallowing hard. Her words struck deeper than any reprimand, resonating with something he had long buried, the fear that a single mistake could define his entire career. The remainder of the day tested him further. She observed as he handled difficult recruits, improvised solutions when equipment failed, and navigated the stress of back-to-back drills. Each scenario was carefully crafted to test his patience, leadership, and resilience. By evening, Evan's exhaustion was physical and mental. Every muscle ached, yet he continued. Each success, each minor victory, was silently acknowledged with her nod or the rare, fleeting glance of approval. That night, as he lay on his bunk, he replayed every interaction. He realized that for the first time, he was thinking beyond simple obedience. He was analyzing, anticipating, and adjusting. The weight of the Admiral's gaze was no longer crushing. It was instructive. Meanwhile, Admiral Cole reviewed her notes privately. She cataloged each reaction, noting the subtle growth of his confidence, the way he adapted under pressure, the sparks of leadership that emerged from panic. She saw promise, and she also saw fear, not a flaw, but a natural part of growth. She recognized that for Evan to truly evolve, he needed to experience the challenge and bear the responsibility before she intervened. Over the next few days, her tests became more intricate. Minor crises, equipment failures, and simulated emergencies forced Evan to make decisions in real time, often without guidance. He stumbled at first, hesitated, and faltered, but with each setback, he learned. And always, the Admiral observed, never interfering, letting him face the consequences of his choices. Evan began to notice a subtle shift in himself. Where once fear had driven every action, now determination and focus took root. Mistakes were no longer humiliations to be hidden. They were lessons to be understood and corrected. And in the rare moments when she nodded, even slightly, he felt an unprecedented sense of affirmation, proof that he was not invisible, that his efforts were recognized. One evening, after another grueling day of drills and inspections, he found himself alone in the barracks when the Admiral approached quietly. She didn't announce herself. She simply stood at the doorway, observing. "You're improving," she said softly, almost conversationally. "Not because I told you to, but because you're learning to lead yourself. That is rare. That is valuable. That is the difference between a soldier and a leader." Evan's chest tightened. "Thank you, Mom," he whispered. The weight of her words, a mixture of praise, challenge, and expectation, felt heavier than any punishment had ever been. "You will make mistakes, she continued, her tone steady and unflinching. "Some of them will hurt. Some will humiliate you. But the only thing that defines you is how you respond. Remember that." She turned, leaving as quietly as she had arrived. For the first time, Evan understood. Her silence, her observation, her tests, they were not threats. They were opportunities. Every glance, every subtle correction, every withheld intervention was shaping him into the soldier he was capable of becoming. That night, lying on his bunk, he felt a new resolve. Humiliation had sparked his fear, observation had sharpened his awareness, and challenge had ignited his growth. For the first time, he didn't fear Admiral Cole. He respected her. And in that respect, he found the strength to face the days ahead, no longer as the boy who drenched the Admiral, but as the soldier learning to rise under her watchful eye. Somewhere in the quiet corridors of the base, the Admiral allowed herself a small smile. The experiment was working. The boy was beginning to learn. And soon, he would discover that the lessons of leadership came not from punishment, but from expectation, challenge, and the courage to meet both. The morning air was sharp and heavy with anticipation. A storm of activity had erupted across the naval training base. The brass had announced a surprise endurance test for the recruits, and Evan Marshall's unit was at the center of it. There was no briefing, no warning. One moment they were standing in formation under the searing sun. The next, orders were shouted, and the recruits were being marched toward the perimeter, gear in hand, backpacks loaded with supplies. Evan's stomach twisted with anxiety. Every nerve screamed in protest, muscles already sore from the week's relentless drills. The moment was more than physical. It was mental, a crucible of endurance, precision, and leadership. And of course, Admiral Rebecca Cole was there, standing at the edge of the formation, clipboard in hand, gray eyes scanning the unit with an intensity that made his chest tighten. She had not said a word to him yet that morning, but the presence of her scrutiny carried the weight of expectation. "Move out," a sergeant barked, and the unit surged forward. Evan fell in step at the front, trying to project confidence despite the knot of fear coiling in his stomach. They had 10 miles to cover in full gear, navigating obstacles, simulated emergencies, and the oppressive heat of the mid-morning sun. It was more than a physical test. It was a test of leadership, endurance, and composure under pressure. The first mile was manageable, if grueling. Evan's lungs burned, sweat streamed down his face, and the younger recruits struggled behind him. He barked orders to keep them in formation, occasionally bending to adjust packs, correct stumbles, or redirect recruits off dangerous paths. His voice, strained but steady, carried authority, a sharp contrast to the fear that had dominated him days earlier. But by the third mile, the test became brutal. One recruit collapsed from heat exhaustion. Another twisted an ankle on uneven terrain. Panic rippled through the unit like wildfire, and Evan felt the familiar twinge of doubt gnaw at him. Every instinct screamed to freeze, to cower under the weight of the challenge, to pray for someone else to take charge. Then he felt it, a calm, unyielding presence behind him. Admiral Cole had moved to the edge of the path, walking beside the unit, eyes scanning each movement with precision. There was no anger in her gaze, no overt scolding, only observation. The calm certainty of her scrutiny was more intimidating than any shouted command, and it forced Evan to focus, to steady his trembling hands and tighten his jaw. "Keep moving. Adjust formation. Hydrate," he barked, voice hoarse. The recruits followed, some limping, some staggering, but all responding to his leadership. He realized, with a mix of fear and exhilaration, that the challenge wasn't just physical, it was mental. How he handled the panic, the mistakes, the fear, was being measured far more than how fast he could march or how strong his arms were. By the 6th mile, Evan's strength was fading. Heat had sapped energy, sweat blinded his eyes, and exhaustion threatened to collapse his mind into despair. The weight of the backpack felt like iron pressing down on his shoulders. He stumbled, nearly tripping over a rock, and for the first time, he allowed a pang of self-doubt to creep in. Then he heard her voice, calm, precise, almost surgical. "You don't earn respect by avoiding mistakes, Private. You earn it by facing the next one." It was quiet, barely audible over the shouts and clatter of boots, yet it struck him like lightning. He froze for a heartbeat, then straightened, swallowing his fatigue and shaking off the panic threatening to overtake him. That single sentence, a whisper of command, an echo of mentorship, ignited something inside. His fear transformed into determination, his exhaustion into focus. Evan took a deep breath, rallying his unit. Form tight. Step in unison. Eyes forward. You are not failing. You are leading. The words rang out, almost as if he was speaking to himself as much as to the recruits. And slowly, painfully, the unit began to move more efficiently. Stumbles decreased, energy rose, and a rhythm emerged. Evan led from the front, guiding, adjusting, encouraging, correcting, and the recruits responded. By mile 9, Evan's body was screaming in protest. Every step felt like a battle against gravity, against his own weakness, against the fear of failure. But he refused to let himself collapse. He remembered every lesson the Admiral had silently imparted: precision under pressure, composure under scrutiny, learning from mistakes rather than fleeing them. He embraced the pain, transforming it into fuel. When they finally reached the 10th mile, the unit was battered, bruised, and drenched in sweat, but functional and intact. Evan's legs trembled, his vision blurred, and his breathing was ragged, but a sense of triumph surged through him. He had led, guided, and persevered. He had survived the test, not just physically, but mentally and emotionally. Admiral Cole approached as the unit gathered for debriefing. Her boots clicked against the concrete, measured and deliberate, and she stopped in front of Evan, gray eyes assessing, unflinching. For a long moment, she said nothing. Then she spoke, calm, precise, and cutting straight to the truth. "You demonstrated leadership today, Marshal. Not because it was easy, not because you were flawless, but because you endured. You did not collapse under pressure. You did not panic when others faltered. That is the mark of a soldier and a leader." Evan's chest tightened, emotions threatening to spill over. He wanted to say something, anything, but words failed him. All he could do was nod, sweat-soaked and exhausted, yet alive in a way he had never been before. She continued, her tone softer now, almost reflective. "You will face many moments like this in your career. Moments when failure is possible, when the weight of responsibility feels unbearable. Remember this: humility and courage are inseparable. You will stumble, but how you recover will define you." For Evan, those words were more than guidance. They were revelation. He realized that every drill, every silent observation, every challenge the Admiral had orchestrated over the past days was building him into something more than a soldier, into a leader capable of facing adversity, inspiring others, and commanding respect not through fear, but through integrity and resilience. As the unit settled into rest, recruits catching their breath and nursing blisters, Evan remained upright, staring at the horizon where the sun burned low and crimson. He felt something he had never felt before: pride not in perfection, but in endurance. Strength not in absence of fear, but in facing it. Respect not demanded, but earned. Admiral Cole, observing from a short distance, allowed herself a rare smile. The boy who had drenched her days ago had begun to transform. The silent lessons, the challenges, and the pressure had taken root. He was learning, growing, and for the first time, meeting expectation with courage rather than dread. That evening, Evan collapsed onto his bunk, muscles trembling, soaked in sweat, and utterly exhausted. Yet his heart swelled with a quiet triumph. The breaking point had come, and he had survived. Somewhere on the base, the Admiral made a note in her records. Marshall is beginning to understand. Resilience emerging. Observation continues. The words were concise, clinical, yet carried an unspoken promise. This was only the beginning. For both teacher and student, the journey had reached a new stage. Evan closed his eyes, remembering her words. You don't earn respect by avoiding mistakes. You earn it by facing the next one. He repeated them silently, like a mantra. He knew. The lessons ahead would be harder, the challenges fiercer, but for the first time, he was ready. Not just to survive the scrutiny, but to meet it head-on. The sun set over the base, painting long shadows across the concrete. The day's trials were over, but the real lessons were just beginning. And Evan Marshall, once the boy who had clumsily sprayed the Admiral with a hose, now understood that endurance, courage, and composure were the true measures of a soldier. For the first time, he did not fear her. He respected her. And in that respect, he had found the strength to rise. The days following the endurance test passed with a strange rhythm. For most of the recruits, life at the Naval Training Base remained a cycle of drills, inspections, and exhausting physical tasks. But for Private Evan Marshall, the world had shifted. The humiliation of the hose incident, the relentless observation, and the grueling endurance test had forged a new perspective. He was no longer just a young soldier struggling to follow orders. He was someone learning to anticipate them, to lead, to think ahead, to act with purpose. Evan woke each morning with a newfound determination. He approached drills with precision, measured his commands carefully, and observed not just his own performance, but the performance of those under his guidance. Where before he had stumbled over simple coordination exercises, he now guided recruits with authority and patience. His voice carried a calm clarity, steady and unwavering, even in the chaos of high-pressure exercises. The recruits, many of whom had initially doubted his abilities, now looked to him for direction. The Admiral's presence remained a constant, though subtle, influence. She rarely intervened, observing from a distance as he assumed responsibilities once reserved for more experienced officers. Sometimes she would appear quietly beside him, clipboard in hand, offering only the briefest nod of acknowledgement or the faintest lift of an eyebrow. Her silence, once a source of anxiety, had become a guide, a quiet encouragement to continue improving. During a particularly complex drill, Evan's unit was tasked with simulating a security breach while coordinating with multiple teams spread across the base. Communication lines faltered, recruits panicked, and equipment failed under pressure. In the past, Evan might have frozen or deferred responsibility, waiting for a superior to intervene. Now, he acted decisively, issuing clear instructions, reassigning personnel, and improvising solutions. His composure inspired confidence in the recruits, who began to respond with efficiency and focus. By the end of the exercise, the simulated breach was contained, and the operation had been executed nearly flawlessly. Admiral Cole approached afterward, walking silently beside him as the recruits were dismissed. "You handled that well," she said, her voice measured and calm. "Not because the exercise was simple, but because you anticipated the challenges and responded decisively. That is leadership." Evan felt a rush of emotion. He had never received such acknowledgement before, not in school, not in life, and certainly not in the military. "Thank you, Mom," he said, keeping his voice steady, even as his chest swelled with pride. "Leadership," she continued, "is not about issuing orders. It is about earning trust. You are beginning to do that, Marshall. Take note." Her words lingered in his mind long after she had walked away. For the first time, Evan realized that respect was not something demanded by rank or title. It was earned through action, through consistency, and through the quiet demonstration of competence under pressure. As the week progressed, Evan's transformation became evident to everyone around him. Where he had once been mocked and whispered about, he was now met with nods of approval and cautious admiration. New recruits followed his example, mirroring his calm demeanor and efficient actions. Senior officers, previously skeptical of his potential, began to rely on him to coordinate complex drills and minor operations. The boy who had once drenched the Admiral was becoming a soldier others looked to for guidance. One afternoon, as the sun dipped low over the base, Evan found himself in the mess hall with a small group of recruits. They were discussing the day's exercises, sharing frustrations and insights. One young recruit, struggling with confidence, voiced a complaint about the rigor of the drills. Evan, without hesitation, offered guidance, sharing strategies he had learned from observation and experience. His words were calm, measured, and encouraging, providing direction without condescension. Across the room, Admiral Cole observed quietly, leaning against a doorway. She noted the subtle changes, the way he commanded attention without arrogance, the way he inspired rather than intimidated, the way he handled questions with patience and clarity. She recognized the growth that had taken place, an evolution from embarrassment and fear to competence and emerging authority. By evening, Evan returned to the barracks exhausted but satisfied. He reflected on the journey that had brought him here, the hose incident, the relentless scrutiny, the endurance test. Each had been a challenge, a moment that could have broken him. But instead, they had forged him into someone stronger, more confident, and more capable. He realized that the true lessons of the base were not in completing tasks flawlessly, but in learning from mistakes, in adapting under pressure, and in growing through experience. Admiral Cole's presence remained a guiding force, even when she was not visible. Her silent mentorship had transformed fear into respect, anxiety into determination, and confusion into clarity. Evan understood now that her tests were not arbitrary or punitive. They were designed to cultivate resilience, judgment, and leadership. And through each test, he had risen from the ashes of his own mistakes. The following morning, during a routine inspection, Admiral Cole approached him directly. She stopped in front of Evan, her gray eyes fixed on his face. "You have improved significantly," she said, her tone calm but firm. "Not because I intervened, but because you chose to learn, to observe, and to act with intention. That is rare. That is commendable." Evan felt a mixture of pride and humility. "Thank you, ma'am," he replied, his voice steady. "Remember," she continued, "this is only the beginning. Leadership is a continuous journey. Mistakes will continue to test you. Challenges will continue to push you. But you have demonstrated that you are capable of rising above them. Continue to do so, and you will earn more than respect. You will earn trust, loyalty, and the confidence of those around you." Her words settled over him like a mantle of responsibility. Evan understood that the journey ahead would not be easy. There would be moments of doubt, moments of failure, and moments of exhaustion. But he also understood that he now had the tools, the mindset, and the guidance necessary to face them. As the day ended, Evan stood on the edge of the training field, watching the sun sink behind the distant hills. The base was alive with activity. Recruits marching, officers coordinating drills, the hum of vehicles in the distance. And among it all, he felt a sense of purpose that he had never experienced before. He was no longer the embarrassed, clumsy recruit who had drenched the Admiral. He was a soldier in the making, learning to lead, learning to inspire, and learning to rise from the ashes of his mistakes. In a quiet corner of the base, Admiral Cole observed him one last time that day. She allowed herself a faint, approving nod. The transformation was real, the potential undeniable. The boy had endured, adapted, and begun to embrace the responsibilities of leadership. And for a teacher who had once been humiliated herself, there was a rare satisfaction in seeing another rise through challenge, observation, and perseverance. Evan, unaware of her gaze, continued his work, guiding recruits, coordinating drills, and reflecting on his journey. He felt a sense of alignment, a harmony between effort and reward, struggle and growth. The lessons of endurance, observation, and mentorship had taken root, and he knew that the journey ahead, though still challenging, was now one he could face with courage and determination. The day closed with a sense of quiet triumph. For Evan Marshall, the journey from humiliation to respect, from fear to confidence, and from confusion to leadership was well underway. He had risen from the ashes of his mistakes, and in doing so, he had discovered the power of resilience, the value of observation, and the quiet strength that comes from earning respect rather than demanding it. The base settled into the evening hush, the hum of activity fading as the sun disappeared behind the horizon. And somewhere in the shadows, Admiral Cole observed, satisfied that the lessons had taken hold. The soldier she had watched, tested, and challenged was beginning to become the leader he was meant to be. Evan Marshall had faced his breaking points, endured scrutiny, and transformed fear into action. He had begun to rise from the ashes, not just as a soldier, but as a leader in the making. And for both him and the Admiral, the journey had only just begun. The day began like any other at the naval training base, with the low hum of engines, shouted commands, and the crisp rhythm of boots on concrete. Recruits filed into formation, officers reviewed schedules, and the sun rose steadily over the horizon, casting long shadows across the barracks and hangars. Evan Marshall, now more confident in his role, moved with purpose. He checked the gear of new recruits, coordinated minor drills, and anticipated challenges before they could escalate. The memory of past mistakes had faded, replaced by a sharp awareness and emerging authority. But that morning, the base was about to be tested in a way no drill could simulate. A sudden alarm shattered the routine, blaring sirens, red lights flashing across the compound. "Security breach," came the shouted orders. "All units, respond immediately." Panic rippled through the recruits like electricity, sending inexperienced soldiers stumbling over each other. Smoke billowed from the storage hangar on the east perimeter, and the sharp scent of fuel and alarm chemicals filled the air. This was not a drill. Evan's heart raced, but the fear that had once paralyzed him was gone. In its place burned clarity. He had been observed, tested, and tempered, and now every lesson crystallized into decisive action. He barked commands, directing recruits into safe zones, assigning teams to contain the fire, and ensuring that civilians and essential personnel were evacuated. Stay calm. Move with purpose. Communicate clearly. His voice, authoritative and unwavering, cut through the chaos. Across the field, Admiral Rebecca Cole observed silently, clipboard forgotten at her side. Her gray eyes scanned every movement, taking note of who faltered, who led, and who rose to the occasion. And there, at the center of the storm, was Evan, no longer the boy who had drenched her with a hose, no longer trembling under scrutiny, but a soldier commanding attention, coordinating efforts, and maintaining composure. The fire had begun to spread. Flames licked the edges of nearby equipment, and the heat intensified the panic among the recruits. Evan didn't flinch. He moved swiftly, reallocating personnel to reinforce containment lines, guiding the most inexperienced recruits away from danger, and improvising with the limited resources at hand. Every decision was critical, every movement decisive. One misstep could result in disaster, yet he acted with a calm intensity that inspired confidence. "Marshal, how long until containment?" shouted Sergeant Daniels, approaching with a squad of veteran soldiers. 5 minutes if we coordinate effectively. Evan shouted back. Reinforce the east flank. Hose lines here and here. Keep communication open. As the fire roared and smoke thickened, Evan noticed a recruit trapped behind a stack of crates, unable to move. Without hesitation, he sprinted through the flames, lifted the young soldier, and carried him to safety. The heat seared his uniform, and sweat mixed with soot, but he refused to falter. Every step reinforced his resolve. He was responsible for the safety and lives of everyone under his command. Nearby, Admiral Cole allowed herself a rare flicker of approval. His actions weren't perfect, but they were courageous, deliberate, and effective. He was thinking critically, leading decisively, and protecting his team. Exactly what she had hoped he would learn from her silent mentorship. Within minutes, the fire was under control. Recruits and personnel were accounted for, damage minimized, and the base's chain of command restored. Exhausted and soot-streaked, Evan stood in the center of the yard, breathing heavily, observing the recruits as they checked equipment and regrouped. The adrenaline was fading, leaving a raw fatigue, but also an undeniable sense of accomplishment. Admiral Cole approached him, her boots crunching on the gravel. She stopped, gray eyes scanning him from head to toe. You handled that situation well, she said, her voice calm but carrying undeniable authority. Not because it was simple, but because you maintained composure, delegated effectively, and protected those under your command. That is leadership in its truest form. Evan's chest tightened. Words failed him for a moment, and all he could manage was a short, respectful nod. Thank you, ma'am, he said, his voice steady despite exhaustion. This, she continued, gesturing toward the recruits now regrouping, is why we prepare. Not for the drills, not for the exercises, but for moments like this. You didn't just survive, Marshal. You led. And that is what sets a soldier apart from the rest. Evan looked around at the recruits he had guided through chaos. They were tired, shaken, but attentive, and a subtle sense of respect lingered in their eyes. He realized, finally, that leadership was more than issuing commands or following protocol. It was about presence, decisiveness, courage, and the ability to inspire confidence in others, even when the situation seemed impossible. For the first time, he understood the true meaning of Admiral Cole's silent lessons. Every challenge, every observation, every endurance test had been preparing him for this moment. And he had risen to it, not perfectly, but effectively. Later, in the debriefing, the Admiral addressed the assembled unit. Today was a test, she said, her tone controlled but firm. Not all tests come in the form of drills. Real crises demand clarity, courage, and composure. Private Marshall demonstrated these qualities. Others contributed admirably, but he led under fire. Remember that. The attention on him was intense, but he didn't let pride overwhelm him. He had learned humility alongside leadership, the understanding that mistakes, missteps, and panic were natural, but the response defined character. He absorbed the lesson silently, letting it strengthen his resolve for the challenges yet to come. As the sun set behind the base, casting long shadows across the yard, Evans stood with his unit, observing the aftermath. Equipment was checked, injured recruits attended to, and calm was restored. The crisis had passed, but its lessons would linger indefinitely. He felt a sense of quiet pride, tempered by exhaustion, and an understanding that leadership demanded both courage and responsibility. In the distance, Admiral Cole watched him one last time that evening, expression unreadable. Then, with a subtle nod, she turned and walked away. The silent acknowledgement was enough. Evan had earned it through action, endurance, and decision-making under extreme pressure. For Evan Marshall, the day had been transformative. He had faced fear, chaos, and responsibility head-on, He had guided others, made critical decisions, and protected lives. In doing so, he had transcended the mistakes of the past, the embarrassment of a single drenched moment, and had emerged not just as a soldier, but as a leader in the making. The crisis had forged him anew, solidifying lessons that words alone could never convey. And somewhere in the quiet corridors of the base, Admiral Cole noted the final observation in her log. Marshall has earned trust under duress. Leadership confirmed. Potential realized. For Evan, the journey was far from over. But he now understood the core truth of his transformation. Respect is earned through courage, action, and composure. Mistakes do not define a soldier. How one responds does. And as he walked back to the barracks, exhausted, soot-streaked, yet confident, Evan Marshall finally felt a profound sense of alignment. He was no longer the rookie who had drenched the Admiral. He was a soldier, a leader, and a young man prepared to face challenges head-on. The silent mentorship had culminated in this moment, and he was ready for whatever trials awaited next. The base settled into evening quiet, but in the minds of those who had witnessed the day, the lessons would not be forgotten. And in the mind of one Rear Admiral, there was quiet satisfaction. The soldier she had watched, challenged, and tested had risen to the occasion. The journey had reached a pivotal moment, and the final chapter of transformation was approaching. The dawn at the Naval Training Base broke gently, the sun casting a soft glow across the rows of barracks, hangars, and parade grounds. The quiet of early morning contrasted sharply with the intensity of the past weeks, the drills, the tests, the humiliations, and the crises that had forged Private Evan Marshall into someone different from the boy who had clumsily sprayed Admiral Cole with a hose. Evan moved with purpose across the base, checking equipment, coordinating recruits, and ensuring that all preparations for the day's exercises were complete. Unlike before, he did so with confidence. Each action was deliberate, each command clear. Where fear and anxiety had once dictated his behavior, now competence, observation, and awareness guided him. He had learned to anticipate, to act decisively, and to lead without hesitation. As he oversaw a formation of recruits, preparing for a simulated operational drill, a ripple of whispers spread through the ranks. Something unusual was about to happen. Evan's instincts told him this was not another test, but a formal acknowledgement, something far rarer and far more consequential than drills or endurance runs. A group of senior officers approached the formation, and at the forefront stood Rear Admiral Rebecca Cole. She moved with her usual measured steps, gray eyes scanning the unit, finally settling on Evan. For the first time in weeks, she did not remain silent or merely observe from a distance. She was here to recognize. Private Marshall, she called, voice carrying over the assembled recruits and officers. Step forward. Evan's heart raced. His instincts told him to stand at attention, but his body and mind were steadier now, trained through weeks of observation, pressure, and endurance. He moved forward, boots crunching on gravel, shoulders square, chin lifted. The murmurs of recruits and officers hushed into silence. You have undergone significant trials over the past weeks. Admiral Cole began, her tone measured, commanding attention without needing to shout. You have been observed, tested, and challenged in ways that few endure. You have demonstrated growth not only in skill and endurance, but in judgment, composure, and leadership. You have faced humiliation, adversity, and crisis, and you have emerged capable, confident, and competent. That is commendable. Evan felt a mixture of pride and humility. He had earned this recognition, but he knew it had been forged through struggle, not handed as a reward. He kept his posture rigid, breathing steady, but inside, a surge of satisfaction coursed through him. Admiral Cole continued, addressing the assembled unit. Private Marshall's journey is a lesson for all. Mistakes do not define you. Fear does not diminish you. What matters is how you respond, how you lead, and how you inspire those around you. Today, we recognize not just a soldier, but a leader in the making. Evan was called forward to receive his first formal commendation, a certificate of recognition pinned proudly to his uniform. For the recruits, this was more than a ceremony. It was a statement. Leadership was not about rank alone, nor about being flawless. Leadership was about perseverance, courage, and the ability to rise under pressure. As he received the recognition, Evan's gaze met Admiral Cole's. Her expression, always controlled, carried a rare flicker of approval, almost warmth. "You've done well, Marshal," she said softly, a subtle acknowledgment of the growth she had nurtured silently. "Thank you, ma'am," he replied, voice steady, though his chest tightened with emotion. The words were simple, yet weighted with gratitude. He had not only survived her scrutiny, but had risen through it. The ceremony concluded, and the recruits were dismissed. Evan remained standing, reflecting on the journey that had brought him to this moment. He remembered the hose incident, the embarrassment, the humiliation, the dread of the Admiral's silent gaze. He recalled the relentless drills, the endurance test, and the simulated crisis that had pushed him to the brink. Each experience had been a challenge, yet each had forged resilience, composure, and leadership. Later that day, Evan was tasked with leading a training exercise independently, a first for him. The Admiral observed from a distance, clipboard in hand, but this time her presence felt different. There was no tension, no silent scrutiny, only quiet observation and trust. Evan led the recruits through complex maneuvers, simulated emergencies, and equipment coordination. He anticipated challenges, corrected mistakes, and guided the group with calm authority. By the end of the exercise, the recruits were exhausted but cohesive, functioning efficiently as a unit. Evan had not only completed the task, but had inspired confidence and respect among those he led. He realized, fully, that leadership was no longer a concept to learn, but a reality he was capable of embodying. Admiral Cole approached him afterward, walking alongside him as the recruits filed past. "You've come a long way, Marshal," she said, her voice calm but carrying unmistakable approval. "The lessons you've learned are not just about drills or endurance. They are about character, composure, and judgment. You have proven that you can rise to the challenge, and that is rare. That is valuable." Evan nodded, absorbing the weight of her words. "I understand, ma'am. Thank you for your guidance," he said. She allowed herself a small, almost imperceptible smile. The guidance was minimal. The growth came from you. Remember that. She paused, eyes meeting his with a clarity that cut deeper than any lesson. Leadership is earned, not given. Respect is earned, not demanded. Today, you have proven that you are capable of both. Evan felt a profound sense of closure. The embarrassment that had once haunted him no longer held power. The pressure, scrutiny, and challenges had become stepping stones. He had not just survived. He had thrived. He had transformed fear into action, doubt into confidence, and hesitation into authority. As the day drew to a close, Evan walked across the parade ground, recruits now following his example naturally. He noticed small gestures of acknowledgement, a nod from a recruit, a quiet "sir" from a younger soldier. The respect he had earned was tangible, earned not through fear or obedience, but through demonstrated competence, courage, and leadership. Later, as he stood alone at the edge of the training field, watching the sun set over the horizon, he reflected on the journey that had begun with a single embarrassing incident. The hose, the scrutiny, the grueling tests, and the crisis had all led to this moment. He had been pushed to his limits, observed under pressure, and guided with precision and patience. And through it all, He had emerged not just as a soldier, but as a leader capable of inspiring and guiding others. Admiral Cole approached one last time, standing quietly beside him. "You are ready for greater responsibility," she said softly. "Not because I say so, but because you have proven it through action. Carry this forward and never forget the lessons you have learned here." Evan nodded. "I won't, Mom," he replied. There was no hesitation, no fear, only clarity, purpose, and resolve. The Admiral gave a subtle nod, then turned and walked away, leaving Evan to watch the horizon. He felt a sense of completion, of full circle. The journey that had begun with humiliation and fear had ended with recognition, respect, and a profound understanding of leadership. For Evan Marshall, the boy who had once drenched the Admiral with a hose, the story was now complete. He had endured scrutiny, embraced challenges, and risen under pressure. He had earned the trust and respect of those around him, including the very Admiral he had once feared and embarrassed. He was no longer a rookie, no longer a novice, but a soldier and leader who understood the weight and responsibility of command. As night fell over the base, the lights glimmered across the training grounds, casting long shadows. Evan stood tall, shoulders square, eyes steady. The lessons of the past weeks were etched into his character, guiding him toward a future of responsibility, resilience, and leadership. The journey had transformed him completely, and in that transformation lay the true measure of success. The Admiral's silent mentorship, the trials and the crises had culminated in this moment. And for Evan, looking out over the base, he now understood and commanded in spirit. The path ahead was clear. Challenges would come, mistakes would occur, and pressure would mount. But now he was ready. He had learned, endured, and risen. He had come full circle. And in the quiet satisfaction of that realization, Evan Marshall knew one truth above all. Respect, leadership, and courage were earned, and he had earned them all.